Welcome to the Therapist Thrival Guide. My name is Miranda. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm here with Letisha and Gina. Both are like veterans of this podcast. They are like my two go-to, hey, I want to talk about this topic. I want you to be on this podcast about it. Mm-hmm. And today we are talking about oppositional defiant disorder. So I know that we all have really big feelings about this episode topic, and so that's why this is going to be a fun conversation. Gina, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself before we get started?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Gina Young. I'm an LICSW in the state of Minnesota and a director of community-based programs in Minnesota. And I also really want to name, I am by no means an expert in oppositional defiant disorder, but have been working with kids for the last 12 years. And it has come across my desk a few times. And I've also supervised staff that have also been working with kiddos that have been diagnosed with it. And so, again, I don't know everything, but I know a little bit about it. So,
awesome. Letisha, do you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. I'm Letisha Harris, and I am an MA studying to get my license to be LPCC. I've worked with kids for a long time, so I've seen it often and not really known exactly what it is or why, so I'm curious about that.
Yeah, and this is one of those topics and one of these diagnoses that feels very taboo for a lot of reasons, and we'll kind of get into that. But I wanted to kind of talk through, like, what does the DSM say? What are the symptoms of ODD? And then I want us to talk a little bit about, like, kind of the taboo nature of it. Like, why are so many clinicians like Gina very resistant to putting this diagnosis on someone's chart? And then even just like maybe peeling back some of the layers, talking about some differential diagnosis and treatment. So that's kind of what my hope is for today. Gina, do you want to just get us started by talking about what does the DSM say about ODD? What do you need to do to fit this diagnosis?
Yeah, and it starts off its own chapter of disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. And so the DSM-5 says that ODD is a pattern of angry, irritable mood, argumentative, defiant behavior, or vindictiveness lasting at least 6 months, as evidenced by at least 4 symptoms from any of the following categories and exhibited during interaction with at least one individual who is not a sibling. So the categories are angry/irritable mood, and there's often loses temper, is often touchy or easily annoyed, is often angry and resentful. The next category is argumentative/defiant behavior, often argues with authority figures or, for children and adolescents, with adults, often actively defies or refuses to comply with requests from authority figures or with rules, often deliberately annoys others, often blames others for his or her mistakes or misbehavior. And the last category is vindictiveness. So has been spiteful or vindictive at least twice within the past 6 months. So there's a note after this that says the persistence and frequency of these behaviors should be used to distinguish a behavior that is within normal limits from a behavior that is symptomatic. For children younger than 5 years old, the behavior should occur on most days for a period of at least 6 months, unless otherwise noted. For individuals 5 years or older, the behavior should occur at least once per week for at least 6 months, unless otherwise noted. Category B, the disturbance in behaviors associated with distress in the individual or others in his or her immediate social context, so family, peer group, work colleagues, or it impacts negatively on social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And category C, the behaviors do not occur exclusively during the course of a psychotic, substance use, depressive, or bipolar disorder. Also, the criteria are not met for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder.
Gosh, it's interesting because, like, when you're talking about different settings, because if you have a kid who's only being oppositional at school, or if you have a kid who is only being oppositional at home, it just gives me more questions than answers, if I'm being honest. And so, like, and I forget, and maybe you said this already, but what is there like an age range or like an age that has to meet ODD?
No.
Okay. I feel like I remember there being one for conduct disorder, though. Like you have to be...
that one's over 18.
Okay. Okay. But oftentimes, like for conduct disorder, part of the diagnosis is that they had ODD, or like it talks about
It's the
that.
precursor. Yeah. ODD is the precursor to CD.
Yeah. So when we're talking about oppositional defiance disorder, why... Tell me, get on your soapbox, Gina. What's your issue with this diagnosis?
Okay. So my main issue is throughout my career of working with children, and I started off in like an agency that was very much focused on the community and working with kiddos with trauma. ODD is often given by hospitals and in acute settings because you're getting a parent report and like reports from other adults and the kiddo, but there's usually sort of a focus on the defiance behaviors. So that can happen. And then I think you see it more often in juvenile justice settings as well, is a kid that won't listen, a kid that won't follow the rules. And in my time working with kiddos, again, not an expert, I have never seen an ODD kid that doesn't have something else going on.
Yeah.
Right. And I've always found an underlying issue underneath the defiance, whether it be a mood disorder like anxiety or depression, or in most cases, PTSD. There's always been another piece to it, right? Children do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in environments and within systems that are heavily influencing their behaviors and their presentations. And so ODD is saying, often loses temper, touchy, angry, resentful, challenges authority, deliberately annoys others. That's like a lot of children I know.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? That's a lot of adults that I also know, depending on the time of day and week. Like, it's just so wide of a scope.
Yeah. Well, and that's even something you see with kids that have depression or kids that have anxiety or kids that have trauma. And so it is just kind of like, it's tricky to me, it feels like ODD is almost like a symptom instead of a diagnosis. Do you know what I mean? Like it feels more like this is a grouping of symptoms that leads to, I mean, of course, that's what a diagnosis is. It's a grouping of symptoms. But, like it to me, it feels like more of a symptom instead.
Right. Yeah, like an added symptom to
for me,
the other symptoms.
The defiance part of it was always communicating that there was a greater need that we weren't addressing, right? Of whether it would be a family. And when I was doing crisis work and going in the home, it was always a structural family issue. Yeah. Right? Like the kid had gotten an ODD diagnosis when they were 6, 7, 8. And that had become the kid's whole identity in the eyes of the parents, right? And so it was this grumpy, bad child. And their parenting changed once that diagnosis came through. So their relationships changed with the child. So I just have never met a kid that truly meets ODD criteria across a lot of settings without there being additional trauma and or mood issues. So, and I think we've learned, and I know you did a little bit of research too, it's the precursor to conduct disorder and then the precursor to juvenile justice and going to jail and prison, right? So to me, it's more a lack of resources and a lack of skills and us meeting the needs of the kiddos in our community. And then we put them in jail. So that's not great, And anybody who gives an ODD diagnosis for any child under the age of 5, we will talk. Like, I'm not a fan of that.
I was just about to say, my 2-year-old should be
never. I would never. And on my team, even they'll get DAs from other people, and we are not giving ODD.
That is so interesting. No, I would never even
never. Even 6 or 7. I'm like, no, they're just naturally figuring out the way in the world.
They're naturally pushing buttons, naturally doing some of this
being
stuff.
Curious, investigating life. Yes, 100%. And I'll name that. I believe ODD is more often given to Black boys.
100%. Yeah.
I think we see that in the data that we know from kids that are getting suspended from school.
Yep.
Like from kindergarten onward, is that it's BIPOC kiddos that are getting sent home. So, and that are not being looked at with as much support and curiosity as we would give other cultures. So that's why I get spicy about it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's good reason, because when you think about it, coming from my own perspective, just hearing you say that, I'm thinking about my 2-year-old, like Defiant, not really, antagonizing his brother, like things that a 2-year-old would normally do. And as he gets older, that probably will continue. It might change and vary in different ways, but is that something that he would then be
labeled as?
More likely to be labeled as ODD, as opposed to a normal 2-year-old who has, obviously there are family structures that are different, right? Obviously there are things that he may have experienced some PTSD or some other things that I'm a firm believer that everybody has experienced some PTSD at some time in their life. But, some people it affects more drastically than others, but just the life structure and the situations that have gone on between his family members and blah, 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 how will that impact him as he gets older? And will this become something that would be more looked at when he's in school as, more of a defiant behavior, as, he resists to do something that maybe he's not comfortable doing, or maybe doesn't understand, or maybe doesn't have a proper communication about, like, what does that look like for him when he gets older, And speaking to it as a person of color, it, is more likely to be looked at as that, as opposed to a child trying to figure out where his boundaries lie.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had a case a couple years ago where there was a kid who, he came to me with an ODD diagnosis. This was a kid who had gone through so many therapists, and either he fired them or they fired him. It just was, I think he was only 12. It was a rough, really hard case, because and to be honest, he met criteria for ODD. He met every single thing. He met it. I mean, and as a new therapist, I remember reading this and being like, he meets criteria, but I'm just really struggling with this diagnosis because I don't want to put this on him. I also don't want to, I also am just skeptical of this diagnosis. And I think that in that particular case, he ended up having psych evals too, because it was a long road kind of coming to me up till that point. Like I said, he had seen a lot of providers, and he also met criteria for major depressive disorder. And kid didn't have any trauma that we were aware of in his background, but it was one of those cases where you're like, I just feel like I'm missing something. Yeah. Yes, we have these symptoms. Yes, he's on his 6th school in the last 2 years. But I just feel like I'm missing something. And I think that it is, I'm not sitting here arguing there are no kids that have ODD, but I think that for some clinicians, ODD can just feel kind of a lazy diagnosis where you're not wanting to go that much deeper.
I'm so glad you're saying that, Miranda. It feels to me like sometimes when people give adjustment disorder, I'm like, what are you doing?
No. Adjustment disorder for 3 years, Gina.
Yeah, exactly. I'd be like, did they adjust anything? Or what's going on? So
continually adjusting.
On my team too. And I'm like, are we giving adjustment disorder? We can do better than that. So yeah, I agree. And I think it's also, I think this aligns too with even people who get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Therapists are like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't want to work with ODD. I don't know how to work with ODD. And then it becomes, they just cycle through people, which just further ingrains the problem and the lack of connection.
Yeah. I don't remember who it was. It was probably you, Gina. It was someone who told me in my early years of being a therapist, when I was first doing all of those that big wave of diagnostic assessments. And I remember thinking about how a diagnostic assessment is really meant to just be a snapshot of what is this? What's giving me the best picture of what symptoms are happening and a roadmap of where to go from here.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be a detailed history on everything that this kid has been through or everything that's happened. It doesn't have to be a super detailed, it doesn't have to go through every single diagnosis. There are kids in your life that you'll work with that will meet multiple diagnoses. They might meet, I had a chart in grad school that I still look at that talks about the the overlapping characteristics of trauma and how like an ODD is one of those overlapping diagnoses. And sure, I could have given that kid ODD. I could have given him, major depressive disorder. I've certainly seen plenty of kids that meet both of those and anxiety. And like you can tack on a million diagnoses onto a person's diagnostic assessment. But I think the question that you have to ask yourself is this giving me the best clinical picture? And is this giving me the best roadmap forward? Yeah. And so I think you just like, rather than just seeing, oh, this kid has ODD, oh, this kid has, they've been diagnosed with X, Y, and Z in the past, I think that it's up to you as the clinician to say, okay, does this still fit this picture even? Or, maybe we're doing like a adjustment disorder for the first diagnosis or something while you're kind of getting to know them and while you're trying to figure out like what is contributing to this clinical picture, because I feel like I'm missing something.
Well, and I think also coming to it with a fresh set of eyes, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think there's something really great about getting documentation from before, because you want to know what's been tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? And we want to get some information about that. But every time you meet a kid, you've got to be open to giving them a fresh set of eyes and a fair start with you, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we have some providers who read that stuff and some who don't. And I stopped reading it because I was like, this has so much of its own bias from all of the providers that came before. Right. And it was like, I want to come in clear-eyed to this situation so that I can make my own decision, So, yeah.
Yeah. And to that point, the child is also, if they've gone through multiple providers, they're also expecting for you to have that same perspective of them, right? They're expecting that label is who they are. And so you coming in with a fresh set of eyes allows for them to not be seen under that label, but to be seen as who they are. And then you can make a proper diagnosis of who they become, right? Because you're looking at them from a fresh set of eyes. Yeah. And it can be very intimidating to see certain diagnoses as a clinician, to see certain diagnoses and be like, oh, what kind of crap am I going to get myself into? Like, what kind of person are they going to be, right? But if you allow yourself to have fresh eyes on it, then you can say, that may be what somebody's perspective of, as Gina was saying, that may be their perspective of this person. But I do have to do my due diligence and allow myself to really see who this person is and see who this child is or this adult, right? See who they are under that lens as opposed to under the lens of somebody else's previous experience with them. We're all coming in with experiences, right? What one ODD child may not be the same as the last ODD child, right? And one ADHD child may not be the same as the last ADHD child. So being able to have fresh eyes and see each child differently each day, right? Each week that you come in to see them, you have to have a different set of eyes. I mean, that was one thing that I learned when I was working in childcare, is that I have to, tomorrow, I cannot say, you did all of these things to me yesterday, right? Like, first of all, that's a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old. They don't really care or remember what they did to you yesterday, right? So I can't come in with that bias, because then I'm not going to be able to truly educate them or truly help them or truly, get to the treatment plan and work on the treatment plan and help them move along in their journey.
I think that's especially key with diagnoses like oppositional defiant disorder, where you come in and you're just like, I'm just going to, I'm going to look at this in a new way and try to see. But I think there's also a lot of diagnoses, even for adults, that, I mean, I was working with a client who came in as an adult and had borderline, and it's like, I'm not afraid of borderline. I love my borderline clients. And I also, you see things like that. And I think like my very first question is usually like, do you agree with this diagnosis? Like, do you think that this is, let's just talk about this. I mean, I think that talking about it is going to decrease some of the stigma and some of the scariness about it. But I think that you can also take the same principles and think about it in, like, when you're working with kids, about how parents might approach a kid, or like, if a parent is exhausted and they're like, this is why my kid's in therapy, or this is what the issue is, and then you sit down and you talk to the kid and you're like, what do you think the issue is, or like what's behind it for you, or what do you want to be working on? And I think that your buy-in is going to be so much greater, but then also you're going to get so much more insight again into like the issues below the behaviors, because the parents are sometimes only looking, parents, teachers, insert, grown up, but a lot of times they're only looking at like, he got expelled again, or like, he's
suspended. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that it's important to be able to take those cases and try to be as unbiased as you can, because those kids probably have a lot of grown-ups in their life that don't believe in them, that don't have any hope for them, that, just only take their behaviors at face value and say, well, he's a bad kid or he's this way. And I think that as therapists, it's our role to like hold on to the hope for our clients, but also hold on to like be able to look deeper.
Yeah. Eliminate some of those expectations.
Yeah.
Because it can be that they don't see much value in them, and it can also be that they see way too much value in them, right? So they think,
he would never do that.
Right? They think so highly of them, right? And the pressure that puts on a child, right, is overwhelming.
Or the enabling that can happen.
Right. You have to be this way. You have to do these things. You have to be. I mean, when I was in high school, I had a friend who was overwhelmed with having requirements to be getting A's all the time. Yeah. And so that pressure that was on her was overwhelming. And so I can't imagine that a child that is considered to be labeled, a certain way or a certain behavior, how much that behavior and the expectation for them to be different is put on them, and how much pressure that, is for them, and
they'll start to believe
what that
it too.
does to that diagnosis. Yeah.
So we kind of talked around this a little bit, but let's talk about like differential diagnosis and like what are some diagnoses or things that like if you have a kid that's labeled as ODD, or maybe you're considering this diagnosis yourself as a clinician, what are some kind of like alternatives, or even just like what could we be looking at? What sometimes masks itself as ODD?
Yeah. ADHD. I think
say more.
That is a big one. I work with a lot of kids with ADHD, and I adore them, and they can be really annoying. And there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
They have big feelings. They have a hard time expressing them, and they want them to get met, and they feel like they're the most important. So I absolutely think sometimes they can lose their temper. They can be very touchy sometimes. They can
have trouble following rules.
Yeah, a lot of struggle with transitions. I think they check a lot of these boxes as well. And so it's important to get that one, either make that referral for testing if that's appropriate for ADHD. Like Miranda said about a snapshot in time, this is a Polaroid of just this moment. And we really need to get a view of the child's functioning across their lifetime and in the various settings that they're in too. So I think there's quite a bit of crossover with ADHD. I think there's quite a bit of crossover with trauma.
Let me pause you right there.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I think the difference, though, with ADHD, too, is like it's coming from a place of hyperactivity, or it's coming from a different place where like ODD would look more like deliberate defiance, where like an ADHD kid would like, believe me, it's frustrating, but frustrating still, but it's like they're not looking at you in your face and being like, I'm not doing that. It's more of like, it might look different, where it's like they're constantly forgetting that they're supposed to be doing something, or okay, sorry, you were saying it also looks like trauma
and autism. I mean, those are the two things. So especially with trauma, and I think a lot of times from my past experience with kiddos with trauma that end up with an ODD diagnosis, it's because they can't trust adults because of things that have happened. And we're talking about like complex trauma over a lifetime, like a child's lifetime. We're not talking about a car accident or one moment. We're talking about repeated losses and repeated letdowns by systems and by adults. And so by the time you get to them when they're 15, they're over it. Like they're not going to trust another adult. They're not going to talk to another therapist. That hasn't been helpful. And so instead the systems have judged and tried to control versus tried to understand and be curious. So, and I mean, trauma looks like a lot of different things for different kiddos. And a lot of the situations that I've come across underneath ODD has been a lot of experiences of trauma, but other people maybe have not identified it as trauma.
Well, and think about it too, like it is not a coincidence that when I worked in the foster care system, that like every kid I worked with as a case manager had been diagnosed with ODD at some point. Like that is not a coincidence. And so whether it be attachment loss, whether it be real traumatic events, like whatever it is, there are things underneath it that are leading to exactly what you're talking about, Gina. And I think that this is especially key when we're thinking about kids who had like pre-verbal trauma, who like can't say what is bothering them. They feel it differently. Like they're experiencing their trauma in their bodies rather than being able to like say it.
Never felt safe or had their feelings validated or their reality validated, right? Of like, it's okay to be scared. Nobody named that for them, right? It wasn't okay to be scared. They had to just not cry and keep moving on with whatever they needed to do. So I agree. So many foster care kids end up with that diagnosis. And that is, I think, really harmful to them. So.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Because that like when I worked as a home study worker, I would write home studies for families, and when they would get matched with a kid, or when we would find a kid that we thought they might be a good family for, then, they would go through a period of what was called full disclosure, where they would get therapy not necessarily therapy notes, actually. They would get just like documentation on this kid so that they could get a really full picture of who they will be adopting, who they might be adopting. And for so many of those families, like they would see ODD and they'd be like, ooh, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can deal with like being a super defiant kid all the time. And then, I mean, naturally my next thought would be like, well, why are you doing this? But also like, but also I think that like that diagnosis was very harmful when it came to whether or not a child was quote unquote adoptable. And so like that was absolutely harmful for a lot of those kids.
Yeah. It's very harmful also when you think about just in the aspect of the child being accepted, right? Like if, like you were just talking about with adoption, with foster care as well, like that child, my perception of defiance is different than another person's perception, right? And so I'm only going off of what I perceive to be defiant. So if I'm saying defiant, I'm thinking like, this kid is going to be running away. This kid's going to be like
that's a good
cursing
point.
me out.
Sure.
This kid is going to be doing all of these things, right? Whereas this kid may just be a kid that says no and is like, very deliberate about their no and just needs to feel a safe space, like Gina was saying. And if they don't feel that safe space, they're more likely to be like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going there. I'm not saying that. I'm not having that, like that. And that defiance is different than like the overt expectation of defiance. And I think it varies in that expectation of who that child is. And so you set the child up for failure when you say that, when you don't, the person doesn't really know the child except for on paper and what somebody else is perceiving to be their behavior.
What about mood disorders? What's the Venn diagram of like ODD?
The crossover?
Yeah.
I mean, I think irritability, especially in any kiddo under the age of 18, is definitely one of the criteria for MDD, right? So, and if we've met any teenagers, they're challenging authority often. And again, like everything's on a continuum, like we're talking about, right? So, but you are absolutely dipping into the mood disorder, pot when you're looking at ODD. And the other one I was thinking about was autism too. Because let me tell you, they want it a certain way. And it's the only way their brain will accept it to be.
Yeah.
Right. And so here comes a grown up who wants it to be their way for whatever reason they have, especially in a school setting or anything like that. And this kid, and this kid is like, my nervous system is not going to deal with that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
especially if they have sensory sensitivities or
huge.
like,
Mhm.
I was even thinking of kids who have trouble communicating. I
Yeah.
mean, like that are on the autism spectrum,
Yeah.
like that's going to be, kids use behavior as language. And so if they don't want to do something and you're trying to get them to, but they can't verbalize that, or, like it might come out in hitting or, like it can look differently.
Eloping, running away. I've been learning more about persistent demand avoidance and how big of an impact that can have on kids with autism and kids with ADHD with a nervous system that's so dysregulated. That's always going to look like defiance to other people. When in reality, it's them needing it to be offered a different way or at a different time when they're calmer and when their body is feeling safer. And so that I'm learning a lot more about. And I think everybody could benefit from learning more about that.
Well, it's like your fight, flight, freeze response, where it's like if you are sensing that, like you're under attack or something, you don't want like if your nervous system is sensing that something is wrong, then your amygdala is gonna be like, okay, we're gonna either
we're off.
These are your options, and for a lot of kids, that's fight. For me, it's fight. Like I'm not gonna punch you, but I'm gonna like fight back.
And
I'm
gonna be defiant.
Right. And so I think, it is just. I think this is just a key part of the conversation where it's like there are so many things that can look like this. But the part to me that I think is very unique with ODD that you don't see in these other diagnoses is like the idea of vindictiveness.
It's that idea of revenge.
Yes.
And like needing to get back at the person. When we started working together, you had a kiddo with ODD who could not let go of like when they had been slighted. Yeah. And they kept like a track in their brain of like, this person they bumped me in the hallway. They took my lunch. They slammed my locker. All of these little things that could be let go. But for this kiddo, were so magnified. Yeah. There is something very unique about that you don't see that necessarily in autism or in a mood disorder, but is very specific to ODD. Yeah.
But it is kind of like an obsession though.
Agreed.
Like to me, when we're talking about a kid who cannot let go of something and it's like they're fixated on being slighted or some of these things, to me, I mean, it doesn't necessarily veer into OCD, but it kind of reminds me of like the obsessions, like I'm fixated on this and I feel like I have to do something about this.
Right.
Which again is like, falls under anxiety, which is what we're just kind of talking about, but
then dips into that too. It's this idea of like, injustice that we talked about too, which is like, if the adults are not going to take care of it, then I'm going to get revenge for what I think was a very serious injustice to me, even if it was small too. And it gets like you said, not just obsessive, but magnified in their mind, and becomes a much, much bigger deal than what is really going on. So.
I mean, but everybody does that on some small level too, though. Like,
yes.
I mean, I don't know. I could have an argument with my partner and then I'm going to like think about it and it's going to get so much bigger in my mind. By the time I see him, we're going to have an argument about it. You know what I mean? Like it's going to get there.
Right. Your part gets smaller and his part gets bigger.
But that's what I'm saying is it's like there are some parts of this that
are common to all people.
Right.
Yes. I think there are shades of it, right, that are normalized to some extent. I get bitter and mad at some people sometimes, and I can't let it go, and I got to figure out how to do that. But with a kid with sort of maybe an overwhelmed nervous system and or trauma, and a lot of adults in systems that are like, you're the problem, I can imagine this. No wonder this gets so big for him, right?
Yeah.
And kids have so little control over so many aspects of their life. Yeah. And then you put this diagnosis on top of them. I can only imagine how invalidating that is.
Yeah.
And that experience too. So
I think to kind of like take that for a second though, like how often are kids being told their diagnoses, or like are they like seeing them on a piece of paper and being like, what does that mean? Or like I think that and adults alike, where I mean you might be diagnosed with something and then I remember I wrote a home study for a family years ago who like when you're going through the adoption process, you have to have a letter from like a therapist. Well, like if you were seeing a therapist, you have to have a letter from them that says like, this is the diagnosis and like we approve them or whatever, which don't get me started on that. That's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, I know.
But
that's a different podcast.
it is. Let me tell you, as an adoptive parent, it kept me from going to see a therapist during my adoption process because I didn't. It was another cumbersome step.
Yeah.
So I'll step off my soapbox. But there's like a letter you need from a therapist if you're seeing one. And I was writing a home study for this guy, and he got a letter from his therapist, or it like got sent to us, and then we included it in the home study. And then he was reviewing the home study, and he was like, what? I'm diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I don't even remember what it was exactly. Or like, but it was a major diagnosis where like he had no idea that he had been diagnosed with this. And I think that like that happens with kids obviously too. Like where they and I don't know how I feel about like it's not like every kid needs to know exactly what their diagnosis is either, but it is just kind of a weird thing where it's like we are labeling you and then we are not talking to you about what this means or like
I could do a whole episode about practice management with children and like the need to keep them informed at a developmentally appropriate space. I'm not going to be using the words that we're finding in the DSM, but they're going to know that they have worries that are affecting a lot of areas of their life. Like it is, as a kid who was in therapy themselves, like I didn't know what I had until later on. And it was like, I should have known.
Interesting.
Like that would have been really helpful. Like my parents maybe would have known. Somebody should have talked to me. Like that would have been really, really helpful. And therapy is so scary for kids anyway, because it's parents making them go.
Oh yeah.
Unless you're over, like 10 and up and you're requesting to go, it's really parents are bringing their littles in and are like, fix these kids.
Right.
You know? And so I'm not participating in that. And it's going to be a way more inclusive environment. And they're going to know when I list and I ask all these questions, I want them to know what we're going to be working on. And I want them to destigmatize whatever disorder we're giving, right? And by not talking about it, we're keeping it in secret. And so, I'm not a fan of that either. So.
I was just going to say, speaking to that, also not weaponizing it against the child, because sometimes you have that parent who's overwhelmed or frustrated and it's like, you have ADHD. Like, it's a weapon against that child as opposed to you have this disorder, that is affecting and impacting your everyday life. And these are the steps that we're taking to help you manage that. That's a different conversation than screaming at them because you're overwhelmed about their diagnoses. And now they're looking at that as a negative thing on top of all the other negative things that they may be experiencing. So not using it as a weapon, but allowing them to understand and have a clarity about what this does, how this impacts you, what things we're doing to help manage that, and how we're helping you to treat that diagnosis so that it helps them to better understand it and better be able to work with it and process through it, as opposed to it becoming something that's negative.
So how do you treat ODD, Gina?
I love that you're looking to me for that. I was doing a little bit of research before and I was looking at the prevalence rate and it's 2 to 11%, which is really small. And it is definitely seen more often in boys than it is girls. I honestly have never met a girl with ODD. I don't think I've ever seen or encountered a kiddo with ODD. I think we should look into the evidence-based practice for ODD. I think in my encounters with it, it's been family interventions and it's been in-home family interventions that have worked with parents on how to support the kiddo and help them build the skills that they need at home and then at school as well. And I want to get back to Letisha said something really great about weaponizing. ODD is very much and can be very much weaponized in the schools. And so if you get a kiddo in special education that has an ODD diagnosis, I've never seen them in the mainstream setting. I see them in level 3 and level 4 schools because it's the teachers who are like, I'm not taking an ODD kid. I can't handle, very similar to what a therapist is saying of like, I can't handle that. They get shuffled along. And it's is this helping them having this diagnosis, or is it hurting them?
Right.
And in fact, are the adults changing their behavior based on the diagnosis that this kid is coming in with? And so they spend 6 hours a day in school, sometimes 8. I mean, that's half their day. And so if their teachers are feeling ill-equipped and or stigmatizing the child, it's in fact just going to make it worse.
Right. So, it's true.
No, so the kids that I've had that have been diagnosed with ODD, I have found the most success with working with them when we can come up with goals together, when we are like heavy with partnership and figuring out, like, what are you getting out of this? Can we come up with like different reward systems? Can we do different things that will, like I had one kid who I had like a ticket system where he got a ticket every time he came to session, and then he had a ticket he got another ticket if he did like something I wanted to do, whether it be, and it was all, I'm a pretty non-directive therapist. And so usually it's going to be like, do you want to, like read a book about, like, what do you want to read a book about? What do you want to do this, or like, and then he got 2 tickets if he brought something to talk to me about. And so then, and this kid was obsessed with Pokemon cards. And so I went through a lot of Pokemon cards with this kid. And, but I think that I want to be clear that like when I started seeing this kid in therapy, I had a hard time at first because I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm making any progress. It feels like we're taking forever to build rapport. And it feels like, it was one of those clients where I'm like, ugh, I don't dread seeing you, but I'm also just like, I don't know what to like.
And you're also not thrilled to see them either. You're not like, hey, this client that I really, really like. Yeah.
But I think it's because I was feeling ineffective. It was because it was more about how I was feeling when I was with him. And then I realized that, like, as I would say, like, I think I worked with him for like a year or something like that. And then by the end of the time that we worked together, I'd love to be able to say, like, you guys, he did make some progress. He made some progress, which was great. But it was just a super hard case where, like, I still kind of think back on that case. I'm like, I still think that I was missing something in there, whether it be some trauma or something that, like, whether it be parent relation, like I just think that I was probably still missing something that, he wasn't communicating to me and I wasn't getting from parents. But, oh man, there's like a lot of beauty in the hard cases and a lot of like room for improvement. And so I if you are a therapist listening to this being like, I have an ODD case that I just am having such a hard time with, like, I just want to say that, yeah, like they can be hard cases. Any diagnosis can be a hard case. It's not just ODD kids, but it's also just like there's a lot of improvement that can happen. And and I would encourage you to look at the individual symptoms and the things that are leading to this diagnosis, kind of like how you're not going to treat autism. You're going to treat the different things that are causing distress around the autism. And I would challenge you to think of ODD the same way.
Yeah.
I looked up some evidence-based practice, and one of them was parent management training, which involves teaching parents effective strategies to manage their child's behavior through consistent positive reinforcement and clear expectations. It's considered the gold standard of treatment.
Makes sense that it's positive reinforcement that works and not just like I'm taking away everything from you.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, at one point, I think when I was working in homes, parents were like removing doors off the hinges and taking everything from the room. And I was like, they look like a prisoner. This isn't going to work.
Right. Yeah.
They're not, it's not going to work. You can't literally take everything from somebody and then still expect them to behave. You know what I mean?
Right.
Especially if they're a kid that has been in foster care or has had trauma, because they'll be like, I've had everything taken away from me before. Go for it.
And I came through it just fine. Yeah.
Okay, that's so interesting. And that kind of tracks with what you were just saying, where it's like so much of
piece.
Involving the
and
parents.
They also listed cognitive behavioral therapy. It can help children with ODD learn to identify and manage their emotions, develop problem-solving skills, and challenge negative thoughts contributing to defiant behavior. I think something that I try to talk about with the people that I supervise is I need you to get an idea of how the child views the world, right? Like if we can get a snapshot into their brain and understand what negative cognitions they might have that have shaped their identity and their behaviors, that's the thing that we can work on to change, right? Yeah. And once you change the negative thoughts, you can then change the behaviors, right? And I think you can do that at a young age too. But somewhere along the line with kids with ODD, it was instead of do what everyone else is doing, I'm going to defy and act out. And what messages did you get around that, right? And so exploring that more, I think CBT is sort of a cornerstone for a lot of the therapy that we do. And so I'm happy to hear that it's in here too as a tool for kids with ODD. So,
well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for both of you. Thank you so much to both of you for joining. This has been a really good discussion, and hopefully this has been helpful for people listening, just to kind of hear some clinicians talk through kind of how they've struggled with this diagnosis and where to go from here, because I think it's not something that is not being, like, it's something that's being diagnosed, and we need to know how to navigate it, and also just how to like see what's underlying too. I think it's important.
I agree.
I don't think kids are inherently bad. And I think that's maybe why I struggle with this one. But
yeah, I think so too.
Awesome. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Miranda.